in the endless and blood-soaked wars of the 41st millennium, where humanity's fragile survival hangs on the edge of extinction against the combined onslaught of Xenos, heretics, and demons. Few fates inspire both awe and horror in equal measure as that of the Dreadnought. To the Imperium, these colossal walking sarcophagi are not merely engines of destruction, but living relics of devotion, embodiments of sacrifice, and symbols of the undying will of the Emperor's chosen. When one strides onto the battlefield, its every thunderous footfall echoes like the heartbeat of a god of war, shaking the ground and turning the tide of hopeless conflicts. Entire companies of Astra Militarum soldiers find their courage renewed when they glimpse the towering silhouette of a dreadnought marching amidst fire and ruin. To the common soldier, they are Saviour's mortal guardians, sent by the Emperor himself. To the chapter, they are honored heroes, veterans of countless crusades whose wisdom and experience cannot be lost to time. Yet behind this facade of reverence and glory lies the grim and terrible truth of what a dreadnought truly is. It is not a machine in the pure sense, nor is it simply an armored vehicle. It is a prison wrought in adamantium and ceramite, a coffin of war within which lies a once proud space marine who has been mutilated beyond natural healing, his body destroyed but his spirit still clinging to life. What survives of him is not flesh or bone but will, bound forever to the machine by sacred technology and forbidden mechanicus rites. This is no honor in truth, but a curse, for a dreadnought's existence begins not in triumph, but in the ashes of near-death, when a space marine is struck down in battle weather, torn apart by alien claws, charred by heretical warp fire, or smashed to fragments beneath the weapons of war. His brethren recover what remains of him with grim reverence. Death is not always the end for such a warrior. If his willpower endures, if his faith still blazes with loyalty to the Emperor, the apothecaries and chaplains intervene to preserve what little life remains. To outsiders, it may appear that the wounded warrior is granted a final chance to serve, yet the reality is far more complex and tragic. The dying Marine is presented with a choice, though it is a choice wrapped in ritual, faith, and pressure. He may embrace death, passing into the Emperor's light to join his fallen brothers in eternal rest. Or he may submit to entombment within a dreadnought, forever abandoning the life and sensations of mortality. Within the deepest sanctums of the chapter, away from mortal eyes, this dark ceremony is enacted. Tech Marines of the chapter and adepts of the Adeptus Mechanicus gather in sacred vaults filled with the stench of oils, the hum of ancient machines, and the chanting of Binharek hymns. Here, amidst incense and sacred oils, the broken warrior is prepared for his final transformation. His shattered body is stripped of what little remains viable. Life support systems are grafted to ruined organs, cables threaded into his nervous system, and implants fused directly into his skull. The sarcophagus awaits a machine of ancient design, its inner walls carved with sacred litanies and runes of warding, its machine spirit restless, eager to merge with the warrior's soul. With solemn reverence, the chaplain recites the oaths of entombment, reminding the Marine of his eternal duty to the Emperor, while the Tech Marines chant the canticles of activation. Once the warrior is placed within and the sarcophagus seals shut, there is no return. His humanity is forever buried beneath armor and iron, his flesh little more than fuel for the machine. Though he remains alive, he is no longer a man in the truest sense. From this moment on, his existence becomes a cycle of silence and battle, long dreamless slumbers in the stasis of the sarcophagus, broken only when the chapter requires his wisdom or his firepower. These awakenings are not blessings, they are torments. When the tech marines activate the Dreadnought, the warrior's mind is dragged violently from oblivion, his senses flooded with cold machine signals as his body of iron stirs once more. He opens his eyes not to light or peace, but to war, the thunder of bolters, the screams of dying men, the clash of alien monstrosities, and the burning stench of a galaxy that knows no peace. Each return to awareness is a reminder that death has been denied to him, that the noble warrior's end he once sought has been replaced by an eternal half-life. To the Imperium, he is immortal. To himself, he is a prisoner, chained within an armored coffin that will never open. He will fight until the day the sarcophagus finally fails, or until the machine spirit within succumbs to silence, at which point his chapter will enshrine what remains of him in the hallowed halls of the dead. Until then, however, he is condemned to serve endlessly. This is the grim reality of a Dreadnought's birth, not honor, not glory, but the cruelest prison of war. If the birth of a Dreadnought is the cruelest kind of survival, then the existence that follows is nothing less than a lifetime of eternal imprisonment. A prison sentence that does not end until the machine itself finally fails, or the Imperium chooses to let its occupant fade into silence. Once the broken warrior is sealed within his adamantium sarcophagus, he is not allowed to live as he once did. His body no longer belongs to him. It is sustained by cold machine fluids, a lattice of tubes, wires, and mechanisms that bind his ruined flesh to the machine spirit of the Dreadnought. The sarcophagus itself is a void, a space of perpetual slumber where the warrior cannot move, cannot feel, cannot even dream as men dream. Instead, he lingers in a state of suspended awareness, drifting in darkness for years or centuries at a time. The passage of time loses meaning within the sarcophagus, dissolving into one long blur of silence and shadows. The warrior's mind is denied the comforts of mortality. There is no warmth, no sensation of air, no beating heart he can call his own. Instead, there is the endless hum of the machine that sustains him, a sound that becomes the rhythm of his existence, like a heartbeat that is not truly his. In this darkness, fragments of memory rise and fade like broken visions, the blue sky of a home world long forgotten, the laughter of battle brothers who died centuries ago, the taste of victory, the sting of failure. These echoes are cruel torments, not comforts, because the Dreadnought knows he will never again experience them as he once did. He has been denied the warrior's death that every space marine hopes for, denied the peace of the Emperor's embrace, and denied the simple gift of rest. This silence is no sanctuary, it gnaws at the mind, stripping away the joy of existence until the only thing left is duty. Duty to awaken when called, duty to kill when ordered, duty to suffer without end. And yet, paradoxically, it is the chaos of battle that becomes his only escape from the crushing silence. When the chapter calls, when the tech marines and chaplains approach his slumbering sarcophagus with chants of awakening and sacred rites, the Dreadnought stirs once more. This is not a gentle process. There is no peaceful return to life, no easing into awareness. Instead, the awakening is agony, violent tearing away from the void, as electrical currents and psychic bindings surge through his withered nerves, wrenching his mind into alignment with the colossal form of the machine. Awareness blooms not in flesh but in metal, the grinding of servos replacing the movement of muscles, the whine of power cores becoming the new rhythm of breath, the flicker of sensors standing in for eyes that have long since been ruined. In those first moments, every Dreadnought is reminded of what he has lost. He no longer feels the world with hands or skin, but only through the alien perception of machinery. And as his senses sharpen, the battlefield reveals itself in all its grim detail. The screams of the dying, the thunder of bolters, the burning wreckage of imperial cities or alien strongholds. This is the only reality that welcomes him back each time. For a fleeting moment, he has purpose, for war is the only thing left to him. He fights with fury, unleashing the rage of centuries through weapons that can tear tanks apart or incinerate hordes of enemies. In these moments, the Dreadnought feels almost alive again, as though he is still a warrior among warriors, still serving as the Emperor intended. Yet this too is only another form of chains. The battlefield does not free him, it only reminds him that he is nothing without war. And when the battle ends, when victory or defeat is secured, he is shut down once more, dragged back into the silence of his eternal coffin. The cycle repeats without end. Slumber, awakening, slaughter, silence. There is no final death, no true release, only the certainty that he will awaken again, again and again, until either his chapter no longer has use for him, or his iron shell finally collapses into ruin. This is the eternal prison of a dreadnought, simply the denial of death, but the denial of everything that makes life worth enduring. It is a fate worse than death, for even death brings peace, while the dreadnought knows only war, silence, and the eternal weight of chains he will never escape. To live as a dreadnought is to endure a torment that transcends the battlefield. For the true horror is not found in the clash of weapons or the thunder of war, but in the endless burden of memory that chains the warrior's mind for all eternity. And though the adamantium sarcophagus preserves what remains of his broken flesh, it also preserves the mind in unnatural sharpness, forcing him to recall with unrelenting clarity every battle, every oath, every brother lost, every triumph, and every agony, until the sheer weight of remembrance becomes more crushing than any wound could ever be. When the vault doors are sealed and silence takes hold, when centuries pass in the span of dreamless slumber, the warrior within the iron tomb does not find peace, for the sarcophagus does not allow forgetting, and so in the hollow darkness he drifts between visions of his past, reliving moments that should have faded with time but instead remain etched upon his soul with cruel precision. And he remembers the laughter of his brothers during the feasts after battle, when they sang hymns to the Emperor with cups raised high, though he himself can no longer taste food or drink, can no longer laugh or sing, can no longer join them at the fire. He remembers the sunlight that once warmed his face beneath his helm on some forgotten world, a sun that has long since burned out, but now he will never feel warmth again, for the machine is cold, unfeeling, and unyielding. He remembers the pride of his initiation into the chapter, the moment his name was sworn into the rolls of honor, the day his brothers clasped his shoulder and called him kin, but now his name is little more than an echo, lost 2 centuries as new generations of space marines rise who know him not as a brother but only as a relic of war. He remembers his victories, the banners raised in his honor, the voices of civilians crying gratitude, the moments when he felt more than human, when he felt as though he truly embodied the Emperor's wrath. Yet all of it is hollow now, for what is glory when one cannot live to savor it, when one cannot share it with those who remain flesh and blood, when one is entombed in a machine that strips all joy from triumph. And he remembers most vividly the day of his fall, the day his body was broken beyond repair, when fire and steel tore through his flesh, and the apothecaries whispered over him, that death was near. But the chaplains refused to let him go, refused to give him the mercy of oblivion, and instead consigned him to the sarcophagus, sealing him into a half-life he did not choose. And he remembers the first awakening, the horror of realizing that his body was gone, that he could no longer feel his own heartbeat, no longer move his own limbs, but instead felt only the alien weight of iron, the grinding of servos, the hum of reactors. The alien whisper of the machine spirit now fused to his mind, and when he saw his brothers again, he saw in their eyes not kinship but distance, reverence mixed with pity, as though he were no longer one of them but something beyond them, not a man but a weapon, and in that moment he realized that memory was now his curse, for it kept alive the person he once was, even as the world treated him as nothing but a relic, and as the centuries rolled on, those memories only grew heavier, for while mortals may forget, while the wounds of time may dull their grief, the Dreadnought never forgets, and so he carries within him the names of every brother slain, the images of every battle, the weight of every oath, and he cannot lay them down. When the vault is closed and silence reigns, these memories press upon him like ghosts, and he whispers prayers to the Emperor not for strength, but for the mercy to forget. But such mercy never comes, for the sarcophagus is eternal. And so he drifts between visions of faces long dead, brothers whose bones have turned to dust, voices that echo but no longer answer. And every awakening to battle is a reminder that he alone remains, his immortality bought at the price of endless grief. And though he slays foes beyond counting, though his claws and cannons rend apart heretics, Xenos and traitors, even in victory he is haunted. For when the battlefield is silent, when the guns grow quiet, and he is returned to his vault, the memories rush back, and the weight of centuries presses down again. And so the greatest torment of a dreadnought is not the coffin, nor the machine, nor the endless wars, but the simple, crushing, inescapable weight of memory that can never be silenced, never be erased, never be forgiven, a burden he must carry until his iron shell is shattered and at last he is allowed the peace of true death. The rage of battle is the truest voice of the Dreadnought, for while silence and memory are his torment, it is only in the storm of war that he is awakened to something resembling purpose. Yet that purpose is poisoned by a fury so deep that it consumes every fragment of his broken soul. And to understand this is to walk into the furnace of his existence. For when the Tech Marines chant their litanies and the vault doors grind open, the warrior inside the sarcophagus is torn from centuries of suffocating stillness and hurled into the thunder of war once more. And though his awakening is agony, the surge of power flooding through machine nerve interfaces, the violent harmonizing of flesh and iron, the alien awareness of senses replacing human sight and sound, the agony quickly transforms into a burning flame that he cannot deny, for rage is all that remains to him. Rage against his enemies, rage against the galaxy, rage against the very Imperium that forced him into this half-life. Each step of his adamantium frame upon the battlefield is like an earthquake, each servo scream like the roar of a chained beast, and when his weapons thunder, when stormbolters bark death into the hordes of Xenos, or the traitor Marines who defy the Emperor, when his claws rip tanks apart like paper, he is no longer a silent prisoner, but a wrath incarnate, and his fury is terrible to behold. For it is not the clean wrath of duty, but the ragged wrath of one who has been denied release, denied the honor of dying with his brothers, denied the chance to lay down arms and join the Emperor in eternal rest. Thus, Every enemy he crushes is not merely an act of war, but an act of vengeance against his fate, each kill a silent scream hurled at the universe itself. And in the frenzy of combat his fury grows until the battlefield itself seems to shudder beneath it. And though to his chapter he is revered as a weapon, to the enemy he is terror given form. Yet to himself he is something far more pitiful. He is a man screaming inside the iron shell. A man who knows no end but endless killing. And though his war song is thunderous, its words are grief. Its verses are despair, its chorus is rage. In this way, battle is both his drug and his curse. For, in its fire, he finds a fleeting distraction from the silence and the memories that haunt him. But the cost is the deepening of his torment. Because rage does not cleanse, rage does not heal, rage only feeds itself. And so with each war he grows more furious. Each enemy slain only fuels the hatred within him. And though centuries pass and the galaxy shifts, the Dreadnought endures. And with endurance comes the unending accumulation of fury until he is no longer simply a warrior in a machine, but a living storm bound in adamantium. His enemies fall in droves before him, but no victory can ever bring him peace. For after every campaign the silence returns. The vault closes, and he is left again in darkness, raging silently against the fate that has robbed him of everything. And in this cycle his curse is complete, for his fury makes him indispensable to the chapter. And because he is indispensable, he will never be released, never be allowed to die, never be given the mercy of final rest. And so battle after battle, century after century, rage becomes not only his weapon, but his only companion, his only voice, his only identity. Until the man who once swore oaths of honor is lost beneath the endless firestorm of hatred that defines him. A hatred that no enemy can truly quench, and no victory can ever soothe. For the true enemy of the Dreadnought is not the heretic, nor the alien, nor the traitor. It is the very immortality forced upon him. And his endless wars are nothing more than his attempt to burn that immortality away in blood and fire, even though deep within he knows it is futile, and that knowledge only makes the rage burn brighter, hotter, more terrible, until the Dreadnought is less a hero of the Imperium and more a monument to its cruelty, a beast forged of grief and fury whose roar echoes across 1,000 battlefields, never ending, never silenced, never forgiven, never free. The curse of immortality borne by a Dreadnought is not the kind sung of in myths or whispered of in tales of gods, where endless life is treated as blessing or gift, but a darker truth carved in iron and sorrow. For to be a Dreadnought is not to live forever in glory, but to be denied the peace of death, denied the release of oblivion, and chained eternally to a half-life of machine and memory. And this curse begins the moment the warrior is lowered into the sarcophagus, when his broken body shattered beyond repair, but still clinging stubbornly to the spark of life, is bound into the throne of pain, and wires are driven through flesh and bone, when his nerves are burned away and replaced with conduits, when his heart no longer beats as it once did, but is pulsed artificially by the machine, when the last fragments of his human senses are stripped away and supplanted by the cold perception of the machine spirit. And though he awakens as a giant, a titan of steel and adamant, the soul within him is smaller than ever, a caged bird that cannot stretch its wings. And from that moment onward, immortality is his punishment. For mortals, even space marines who are the Emperor's chosen, life is fleeting, glory is temporary, and death is inevitable, but in that death is peace. In that death is reunion with brothers and with the Emperor. In that death is an end to struggle, but the Dreadnought is robbed of that end, and instead he is condemned to endure for centuries, even millennia, fighting war after war, sleeping in endless darkness when there is no need, waking again to slaughter when the chapter calls, his body never healing, his soul never resting. And this cycle stretches across generations until even the memory of his name fades from living tongues, until new brothers who have never known him as a man treat him only as a relic, a weapon, a monument of ancient days. And yet he remembers everything with a clarity that no mortal could endure, for his sarcophagus preserves the mind as surely as it preserves the flesh. And so his curse is doubled. He cannot die, and he cannot forget. Immortality, then, is not a gift to him, but a gnawing hunger that consumes what little remains of his humanity. For every century lived strips away another layer of his soul, replacing it with the cold logic of the machine spirit fused into his essence. And though he resists, though he clings to his memories of brotherhood and faith, he feels himself eroding, feels the rage and silence devour more and more of what he once was, until he wonders if, in the end, he will no longer be a man in a coffin, but only the coffin itself, the warrior lost forever within the iron, replaced by a hollow echo that obeys the chapter's commands without thought or will. This is the truest horror of immortality as a dreadnought. Not simply to endure forever, but to endure while slowly losing the self, to feel one's own identity dissolving, and to be powerless to stop it. Yet the Imperium calls this honor, and the chapter chants hymns of reverence before him, and mortals kneel in awe of his presence, and enemies tremble before his weapons, never knowing that within the towering machine the warrior is not proud but broken, not honored but damned, not immortal but endlessly dying. Each awakening a death of its own, each silence a reminder of chains, each battle another howl against eternity. And as the centuries turn into millennia, the curse of immortality becomes heavier, for the galaxy itself changes empires, rise and fall, enemies evolve. The very stars burn out, tan still the dreadnought endures, watching everything he once knew crumble into dust while he remains, a constant in a universe of decay. And though some part of him longs for death, longs for release, another part is twisted by the curse, made bitter and wrathful, determined to fight on not for glory but in spite of existence, as though to challenge eternity itself. And so he rages, slaughters, survives, and sleeps again, his soul eroded yet unbroken, a paradox of despair and defiance locked forever in adamantium. If the battlefield is fire and fury, the silence between wars is the abyss. And for the dreadnought, it is this silence that becomes the heaviest shackle of all. For though his rage in battle is terrible, and his memories are chains that never loosen, it is the centuries spent in dreamless, suffocating darkness that grind his soul down into something unrecognizable. Because when the last cannon has fallen quiet, when the cries of the dying fade, when the banners are lowered and the tech marines march him back into the vault, the warrior who was once alive in war is shut down again, his towering body made inert as the sarcophagus systems fall silent, leaving only the faint hum of sustaining machinery in a tomb of iron and stone. And though to his chapter this slumber is mercy, a chance for him to rest until he is needed again, to the one trapped within it is no rest at all, but torment beyond comprehension. He does not dream as mortals dream, does not drift into visions of warmth or peace, for his mind is locked in unnatural awareness, floating in the dark, unable to move, unable to speak, unable even to scream. Time has no meaning here. Centuries blur into one another. Whole generations rise and die outside the vault, while the warrior within remains frozen, suspended in a silence so absolute it seems to crush him like an ocean pressing upon his chest. Though he has no chest that breathes, no lungs that can gasp for air, the silence is not empty. However, it is filled with ghosts, with echoes of memory that rise unbidden and haunt him endlessly. The laughter of brothers at feasts, the cries of comrades on the day they fell, the sunlight on a homeworld he will never see again, the oath he swore to fight until death. An oath now twisted into a cruel parody because death has been stolen from him. He whispers prayers in his mind to the Emperor, pleads for release, but no answer comes, only the slow, eternal tick of machinery keeping him alive against his will. And as decades become centuries, the silence breeds something far more dangerous than grief. It breeds madness. Some dreadnoughts, their spirits too weak, fall into delirium, their minds breaking into fragments that fuse with the machine spirit until they are no longer men at all, but only hollow war engines that roar when awakened and obey without question, their humanity devoured by silence. Others rage endlessly, screaming within their coffins until the chapter dares not wake them unless desperation demands it. For their fury consumes everything, even friend and foe alike. Yet some endure, clinging stubbornly to sanity, though they suffer no less, carrying their torment with a grim acceptance that this silence is their eternity, and that the only release they will ever know is when their machine shell is finally destroyed in battle, their sarcophagus shattered beyond repair, their soul burned out at last in fire and blood. But until then, the silence remains, a suffocating void that erodes all hope, all joy, all sense of self. The vaults where they sleep are vast cathedrals of iron, lit by flickering candles and stained with incense smoke, lined with rows of immobile dreadnoughts like statues of gods, each one a warrior entombed, each one alive yet utterly still. And in this eerie stillness, even the tech marines tread softly, knowing that, though the machines appear silent, the men within them are awake in their prison, listening, waiting, suffering. This is the paradox of the Dreadnought's existence. He is a weapon of war, designed to stride across battlefields and crush armies. Yet he spends far more of his eternity not in war, but in silence, interred in vaults, forgotten by living brothers, gathering dust like an ancient relic, a relic that feels every second of its imprisonment. To live for war but be denied war, to crave death but be denied death, to remember life but never taste it. Again, this is the silence between wars. And it is here, not in combat, that the true horror of the Dreadnought's curse is revealed. For the battlefield at least gives him rage, purpose, motion. But the vaults give him nothing but darkness, nothing but waiting, nothing but endless chains. And so, in this silence, the warrior fades further, his humanity eaten away, his mind weighed down by centuries of thought with no escape, until he wonders if he has become less than a man, less than a soul, and more only a shadow bound to iron, kept alive not because he wishes to be, but because the Imperium demands it. And the Imperium cares nothing for the torment of a single soul, only for the weapon he has become. Thus the silence between wars is not rest, not mercy, but the truest battlefield of all, where the enemy is despair itself, and where the Dreadnought fights not with cannons or claws, but with the fragile remnants of his will, clinging to what little of himself still survives, knowing that when the vault doors open once more, When the chaplain's hymns call him to battle again, he will roar into the fray with fire and fury. But he will return here again, to silence, to the abyss. Two chains that will never break until the end of all things. The burden of legacy weighs heavier upon a dreadnought than any armor of adamantium or any weapon he carries into war. For though his body is steel and his strength unmatched, it is his role as living history that crushes him most. For he is not merely a warrior, but a monument to everything his chapter once was. A relic that embodies traditions stretching back across millennia. And within him lives the memory of battles no living brother recalls, names no tongue still speaks, victories long turned to dust, and defeats buried in silence. And this endless weight is both honor and curse. For the chapter venerates him as a sacred relic, kneeling before his immobile shell, chanting litanies of respect, decorating his hull with purity seals, etching into his plates the oaths and glories of wars fought long before the young Astartes around him were even born. Yet in the sarcophagus, the warrior within knows that such reverence is hollow, because though they treat him as legend, he knows the truth of what he endured, the pain, the loss, the endless suffering that such legacy required. And though he roars with pride when awakened, though his cannons speak of loyalty to his chapter, the truth in his heart is far more bitter. For legacy is not a gift he asked for, but a chain he cannot break, binding him to wars he no longer wishes to fight, binding him to a brotherhood that no longer remembers his name, binding him to a history that will never end as long as his sarcophagus endures. Legacy means he is forced to be both man and myth, yet neither fully, and this paradox eats at him. For when the chaplains recite his deeds, when young Astartes gather before his immobile form to hear tales of glory, he feels pride stir for a moment. Pride in the battles he fought, pride in the enemies slain, pride in the service rendered to the emperor, but then despair follows, because the faces of those who fought beside him are gone. The voices of those who called him brother are lost, and the glory they sing of was bought with pain that none of these young warriors can ever understand. And so he feels like a lie, a story told to inspire the living, when in truth he is nothing more than a prisoner caged in iron. Yet the burden of legacy is not only within the chapter, but in himself, for memory is his curse, and he remembers far too much, carrying within him the weight of thousands of years of war, each generation piling another stone upon his back, until his soul staggers beneath the endless weight of what he has endured. And this is why he sometimes rages when awakened, why his cannons thunder not only against the enemy but against fate itself. For he knows that no living brother, no mortal scribe, no imperial citizen can ever understand the true cost of the legacy they so easily revere. He sees banners raised in his name, hears hymns sung of his deeds, yet he knows the truth that those deeds left him broken, entombed, denied death, denied peace, condemned to endure forever, so that others might point to him as symbol, as relic, as proof that the chapter endures across the ages. Legacy, then, becomes a weapon turned against him. For every time the chaplains call him ancient hero, every time the librarians inscribe his sagas into the annals, every time young brothers look at him with awe, it reminds him not of honor but of chains, not of glory but of sorrow, not of triumph but of eternal imprisonment. And though he cannot voice this pain, though he cannot tell them that he would trade every hymn and every honor for one moment of peace, he feels it in the silence of his mind, feels it in the endless nights of his slumber. But still, he cannot cast it off, for he is bound by oath, bound by faith, bound by the very legacy that suffocates him, and so he endures, carrying the weight not only of his own memories, but of the chapter itself, embodying in his suffering the continuity of the Imperium, a living reminder that even when brothers fall, the chapter does not die, because he still fights, he still lives. He still roars in the name of the Emperor. This is the cruelest part of his burden, that his suffering is necessary, that his imprisonment is what inspires the living, that his torment is fuel for the fires of faith. And so he cannot rebel, cannot refuse, cannot cast aside the role forced upon him, for to do so would betray everything he once swore, would betray the Emperor himself. And though he wishes for release, he cannot wish for dishonor. Thus, he carries the burden of legacy like a cross of iron across the millennia, each step heavier than the last, each silence deeper, each awakening harder. And though he knows that one day his sarcophagus will fail, his machine body will shatter, and his soul will finally be freed. Until that day comes, he will endure, for that is his curse and his duty, both to be legacy incarnate, to be history bound in iron, to be the endless chain that links the past to the present, even if it crushes him to dust within. Madness is the shadow that follows every dreadnought across the centuries, as unshakable as the coffin of adamantium that binds his body. For no mind, no matter how strong, can endure the endless passage of time, the agony of broken flesh fused to iron, and the eternal cycle of war and silence without beginning to crack beneath the weight. And though the chaplains of the chapter recite their litanies, and the tech marines intone their machine prayers, though the apothecaries claim that faith and discipline will preserve the spirit, the truth is that madness seeps into the sarcophagus like water through stone, slowly, inexorably, shaping the warrior's soul until it no longer resembles the man he once was. And this madness is not always the same, for each dreadnought carries his burden differently. Some lose themselves to rage, roaring endlessly at enemies who exist only in memory, lashing out at allies when awakened. Their fury is so great that even the chapter fears to unleash them save in the direst of need. Others fall into despair, withdrawing so far within themselves that when the hibernation systems shut down and the tech marines call them to rise, they remain silent, as though their will has retreated into unreachable depths, speaking only in whispers or not at all, their minds hollowed by centuries of silence. And still others fragment, their memories shattering into shards that no longer connect, so that when they speak, they utter words from different ages, addressing brothers who have long been dead, speaking of battles fought 10,000 years before, as if they are living in a time none around them can understand. This madness terrifies the livingest, who look upon their dreadnoughts with awe and reverence, but also with fear, for they see in them the fate that might one day be theirs, and though they do not speak of it openly, whispers circulate in the barracks that some dreadnoughts are closer to demon engines than to men, that their machine spirits have swallowed their humanity whole, that their wrath and sorrow have transformed them into something monstrous. And indeed, the line is thin, for the union of man and machine is never clean, never perfect. And though the tech marines maintain the sarcophagus with sacred oils and binding chants, though they rebuke the machine spirit with their rituals, they cannot halt the slow erosion of the human soul. And so every dreadnought lives under the shadow of madness, never knowing when it will claim him, never knowing when the silence of centuries will finally break his will. The most terrible of all are those who embrace their madness, those who cease to resist, who surrender to the iron voices whispering in their minds, who merge fully with the machine spirit and let it guide their fury. Such dreadnoughts often become uncontrollable, their hunger for battle insatiable, their voices reduced to booming roars that are less speech than thunder. And though they may still fight with unmatched ferocity, they are no longer the brothers they once were, but something other, something alien, something frightening even to the chapter they once swore to protect. And yet, despite this horror, the Imperium persists in binding its heroes into these coffins, persists in chaining them to this fate. Because the Imperium cannot afford mercy, cannot afford release, cannot afford to lose a weapon so powerful even, if it means condemning a soul to torment and madness for all eternity. And so the madness grows. Battle after battle, silence after silence, century after century, until even the strongest cannot hold it at bay. And though they may roar hymns of loyalty when awakened, though they may tear apart Xenos and heretics with holy fire, within the sarcophagus the whispers never stop. The ghosts never rest, and the shadows never leave. Madness is inevitable as the rust that gnaws at steel, as inevitable as death but for the Dreadnought. Death never comes, and so the madness only deepens, until what remains is not a man in a machine, but a ghost in a prison, screaming endlessly into the void. The chapters do not speak of this openly, of course. They call their dreadnoughts venerable, honored, noble relics of war, and they parade them in ceremonies as symbols of endurance and faith. But behind closed doors, the chaplains pray harder for them than for any living brother, because they know that their torment is beyond words, and the tech marines mutter grimly of corrupted machine spirits, for they to know that madness can infect not only the mind of the warrior, but the very core of the engine, twisting man and machine into a single entity of rage and sorrow. And yet, despite all this, the dreadnoughts endure. For that is their curse and their strength. Both they endure madness, they endure silence, they endure eternity. Because they have no choice. Because to fall is to betray. Because to seek death is to fail. And so they fight on even as their sanity crumbles, even as their humanity fades, even as the shadows grow longer around them, until one day, perhaps, they are nothing but shadows themselves, a flicker of memory within a shell of iron, roaring eternally into the void. There comes a time in every dreadnaught's eternity when the endless silence, the cycles of war and slumber, the burden of legacy, and the shadow of madness all converge upon one final battlefield, and this is the moment of the last stand, a moment whispered of by chaplains and recorded in the annals of the chapter not as tragedy but as triumph. Yet to the one within the sarcophagus it is far more complex, for it is both curse and salvation, both end and beginning, both despair and hope. For millennia he has endured, chained to existence, denied death, denied peace. But on this battlefield, at last, the chance for release comes. And though he knows that his fall will bring sorrow to his chapter, though he knows that in death they will lose a living relic of their past, he also knows that this is the only way his torment can end, the only way the silence will finally close around him forever. The last stand is never fought in quiet corners or forgotten fields. It is always upon the stage of history, always upon a battlefield where the chapter needs him most. For the dreadnought is too valuable to be cast aside lightly, and so when he falls, it is always in fire, always in fury, always with the banners of the chapter flying above him and the voices of brothers roaring round him. Perhaps it is against the Tyranids, where endless waves of chitin and claws swarm across the field, and he alone holds the line, his cannons blazing, his claws tearing, as he becomes the immovable wall between his brothers and annihilation. Perhaps it is against the Orcs, where green tides flood the horizon, and he wades into them like a god of war, his steps shaking the earth, his voice booming across the din, his every strike felling dozens until the ground itself is littered with broken bodies. Perhaps it is against the traitor Marines, those who once swore the same oaths he did, and in their eyes he sees the mirror of what he might have become. And so he fights with a fury born not only of loyalty but of defiance, roaring the Emperor's name with every strike. In this moment, the Dreadnought becomes everything he was meant to be, everything the Imperium demanded of him, a weapon of unstoppable wrath, a relic of impossible endurance, a hero of legend. But unlike every battle before, unlike every silence endured, he knows in this moment that his shell cannot withstand forever, that the enemy will tear him down, that his sarcophagus will crack, that his body will burn, and instead of despair he feels something like peace. For this is what he has longed for across the centuries. This is the release denied him for so long, and though he fights with every ounce of strength, though he destroys hundreds before they can bring him low, in his soul he whispers thanks to the Emperor, thanks that at last his service is ending, thanks that at last he can join his brothers in death. To his chapter, it is a moment of glory, a saga to be told for generations, but to him, within the coffin of iron, it is the sweetest release imaginable, the breaking of chains that bound him for thousands of years. Yet the last stand is not only about release, it is also about legacy. And in those final moments, as the machine cracks and burns, as the sarcophagus begins to fail, the Dreadnought reflects upon the eternity he has endured, upon the brothers long dead whose names he still remembers, upon the countless enemies he has slain, upon the banners he has defended. And though sorrow fills him for all he has lost, there is also pride, for he has not faltered, not once, across the millennia. Though madness has gnawed at him, though silence has crushed him, though immortality has cursed him, he has endured, and in enduring, he has proven that the Emperor's will is unbreakable. In his final seconds, perhaps he sees visions, his homeworld's mountains, the training halls where he first swore his oath, the faces of brothers long fallen standing beside him once more, the light of the Emperor shining brighter than any sun, and for the first time in centuries, he feels no pain, no rage, no despair and peace. The last stand is fire and blood, it is the roar of cannons and the clash of titans, but within the sarcophagus it is also quiet, a silence not of torment but of release, the silence of death at last come, when his shell collapses, when his body burns, when the machine finally shatters and the sarcophagus ruptures. The warriors around him cry out in grief, for to them they have lost a hero, a relic, a living link to their past but for him. It is victory, the greatest victory of all. The freedom denied him for millennia, the final end to the curse of immortality. And though the chapter will mourn him, though they will raise monuments in his name, though they will etch his deeds into stone and sing his saga in the halls of their fortress monastery, he will no longer hear, he will no longer endure, he will no longer suffer, for he is free. And in that freedom lies the true meaning of the last stand, not the glory of the Imperium, not the triumph of the chapter, but the salvation of a soul that has carried too much for too long. Even when the Dreadnought has finally fallen, when his sarcophagus lies shattered upon the battlefield and his body is nothing but wreckage smouldering beneath alien skies or burning in the ruins of human cities, his story does not end, for the Imperium does not allow endings, and in truth, no one who has endured such millennia of torment can ever be fully silenced. For there are always echoes in the memories of brothers who fought beside him, echoes in the sagas sung by chaplains in the dark halls of the fortress monastery, echoes in the inscriptions carved upon the banners and relics left behind, echoes in the haunted whispers of tech marines who worked upon his frame and still hear his booming voice in their dreams, and even echoes in the silence of the vaults, where empty sarcophagi remind all who look upon them of the souls who once endured within. These echoes are eternal, stretching far beyond the life of the man or the lifespan of the machine, because they are bound into the very fabric of the chapter itself, into its traditions, its songs, its faith, its identity. And though the Dreadnought at last has won release, his torment has not been meaningless, for the echoes of his existence will continue to shape warriors yet unborn, will inspire courage in recruits who never knew his name, will burn in the hearts of brothers who feel despair upon alien fields and recall that once there was a warrior who endured worse than they and still fought until the end. This is the paradox of the Dreadnought's fate. Though he longed for death, though he prayed for peace, though he fought to be free, his legacy ensures that he will never truly be forgotten, never truly fade, and though this might have once filled him with sorrow, now it is something else, perhaps comfort, perhaps a strange kind of immortality that is no longer curse but gift, for his soul may have been freed to the Emperor, but his echo remains to guide and strengthen those who follow. These eternal echoes are not only in song and stone, but in the very way the chapter perceives itself. For every Dreadnought who has ever fallen is remembered in the their wisdom passed down, their warnings preserved, their sacrifices held as examples, so that even in absence they fight still, and in this way, their curse is transformed into a beacon of endurance, proving to every space marine that though suffering is eternal, so too is loyalty, so too is faith, so too is duty. Perhaps, in the warp's strange currents, their voices linger, whispering still across time, haunting the dreams of librarians who touch too deeply into memory. Or perhaps their echoes drift among the stars themselves, carried in the psychic residue of millennia of battle, so that in some ineffable way, every Dreadnought who ever lived still watches, still remembers, still endures beyond death. To the Imperium, this is the only immortality that matters, not the cursed existence of flesh bound in iron, but the immortality of echo, of name, of legacy, of the eternal presence of sacrifice. And so, when a Dreadnought is finally laid to rest, when his shattered frame is carried back to the fortress monastery and interred in sacred vaults, when the banners are lowered and the chapter chants his saga one last time, the brothers do not grieve as mortals grieve, for they know that he is not gone, not truly, but has become something greater, something eternal, something that will never fade, so long as the chapter itself endures. Yet in the silence beyond, perhaps the soul of the warrior, freed at last from the chains of adamantium, looks back upon the echoes left behind, sees the banners raised in his honor, hears the songs sung in his name, and feels a kind of peace he never knew in life. For though his body was prison, his memory has become light, and though his immortality was curse, his echo has become blessing. This is the final truth of the Dreadnought, that even in release, he endures, not as prisoner, but as legend, not as relic, but as eternal echo in the halls of the Imperium, where countless others will follow his path, countless others will endure his curse, and countless others will leave behind echoes of their own until the end of time itself.